There is a precise moment when a man understands that the quiet life he built with 12 years of hard work and deliberate solitude is finished. For Kalen, that moment arrived not with the crash of thunder or the crack of steel, but with the cold iron tip of a militia spear pressing against the hollow of his throat. The rain was coming down in gray curtains over the cobblestones of Oakhaven Square, washing the mud in rivulets toward the gutters, plastering Kalen's wool coat to his ribs. Around him, in a tight semicircle, beneath the dripping eaves of the assembly hall, stood the men he had called neighbors for a decade and more. The blacksmith who had sharpened his axes every autumn. The miller whose flour he bought on credit when the timber sales ran late. The farmers whose carts he had helped pull from the spring mud without being asked. All of them looking at him now with eyes the color of the slate on a storm morning. None of them met his face. They stared at his hands, bound behind him with rough hemp cord, and they stared at the figure kneeling in the mud at his left side. Varka of the Red River clan was 6 feet of green-skinned warrior in iron chains, her shoulders broad enough to block the wind from Kalen's side even on her knees. Her amber eyes moved across the gathered crowd with the systematic assessment of a soldier cataloging threats, exits, weapons, faces, distances. Her spear wound had been cleaned and bound. Kalen had seen to that before the militia found them. The iron collar around her neck caught the gray light and reflected nothing back. Elder Thomas stood on the dry porch of the hall with his hands folded over his mahogany walking stick, his long gray coat immaculate despite the rain that had been falling since before dawn. He did not look angry. Anger was for men who doubted their own power. Thomas looked satisfied. The careful, unhurried satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for a particular piece of paper to sign and had finally been given it. 12 years, Thomas said. His voice carried across the square without effort, cutting through the rain. 12 years you lived among us, Kalen. We gave you the timber rights along the Slate as reward for your service in the King's War. We left you to your silence and your river, and we asked nothing of you. And this, he paused, letting the pause work for him, is how you use that peace. Kalen did not answer. The young guardsman holding the spear had his hands slightly unsteady, oscillating between excitement and fear. And Kalen had learned in the trenches of Red Pass that a nervous man with a weapon required less provocation than a confident one. He kept still. He kept his chin level. To his left, Varka swung her head slightly toward him. The amber eyes carried one clear message. If this ends badly, it ends with teeth. He gave her the smallest possible shake of his head. Not yet. Thomas was still speaking. Something about the Valley Council's provisions regarding orc presence within the settlement boundary. Something about the confiscation of his timber rights along the Slate being effective immediately, his cottage and garden, and the 12 years of work he had put into both reverting to the council as of sundown. The words came out in Thomas's particular administrative monotone, a voice that turned other men's lives into paragraphs of legal language. Kalen let the words happen over him and thought instead about fog. It had been a foggy Tuesday morning, 6 hours ago. He had woken before dawn the way he always woke. Without an alarm, without effort. The light not yet showing through the oilskin windows of his cottage. And he had pulled on his boots and his heavy canvas coat and taken his timber hook from beside the door and walked down to the Slate River to see what the night had brought. The Slate was a glacier river that ran fast and cold out of the Black Ridge crags. Gray with silt even in summer, running shallow and furious over smooth stone, and deep and deceptively quiet in the bends. Kalen had been living off its gifts for 12 years. Birch logs for the hearth, rounded quartz for the stonemason, the occasional fat trout that made the mistake of taking a bone hook. He knew the river the way a man learned something by living next to it for years. not by studying it, but by paying the kind of automatic daily attention that eventually becomes knowledge. The fog that morning was thick enough to muffle sound. He could hear the water, but could not see it past the first 30 yards of bank. He walked the muddy shoreline with his timber hook, his bad left knee clicking with each step in the familiar rhythm that had accompanied him since the siege of Red Pass took something out of the joint that no surgeon had ever successfully put back. He saw the shape before he identified it, dark and heavy in the shallows, wedged between two half-submerged boulders near the outer gravel bar. His first instinct was elk. The crags shed them in spring, and they came down the river unreasonably large and completely dead. But the shape was wrong for elk. The color was wrong. What he could see through the fog caught the gray morning light differently than hide or antler. He got closer. The iron collar caught the light first. 3 inches of cold forged iron around a green throat. The chain that had once attached to it snapped short and rusted. The heavy links twisted and torn at the break. She was lying face down in 6 inches of freezing water. Her left arm pinned under a waterlogged pine trunk, her back moving in the shallow hitching rhythm of a person who had not yet stopped breathing, but was negotiating the terms. Kaylin stood on the bank for what was probably 30 seconds and felt like considerably longer. He had served 4 years in the King's infantry, 2 of them at Red Pass, where the Orc clans and the kingdom had ground against each other in the mud and stone for 18 months until a treaty was signed that satisfied neither side and left both with precise and lasting grievances. He knew the village law regarding orcs. The sign at the south gate had been there since before he arrived, longer than Thomas's tenure on the elder's bench. He knew what Thomas would do with the information that an orc had been found on or near his property. He also knew what it meant when someone was drowning alone. "Keep walking," he said quietly to himself, the infantry habit of talking through decisions as a way of making them real. "Turn around and keep walking, old man. It's not your river, and it's not your business, and there is nothing on that bank that has anything to do with you." He stood there. He thought about his brother Julian, who had died at Red Pass in the mud of a forward trench 20 years ago, of a wound that should not have killed him if someone had reached him sooner. Kaylin had been 100 yards away. 100 yards was too far. "Damn it all to hell," he said, and waded into the current. The cold hit him like a physical blow, every nerve firing simultaneously, the air rushing out of his lungs with a noise he was glad no one was close enough to hear. He kept moving. He reached the gravel bar and grabbed the waterlogged pine trunk that was pinning her arm and put his back into it, his bad knee screaming from the angle and the cold, his teeth clenched. The trunk moved 4 inches and her arm came free. He dragged her out of the water by the shoulder of her leather armor. She was heavier than any log he had pulled from the slate. By the time her torso was on the dry bank, his lungs were burning and his left leg was threatening to give entirely. And he was making calculations about whether he could get her up the muddy bank to the lean-to behind his cottage and what he would need, and how long he had before the morning patrol came down from the settlement. He rolled her onto her back. She was perhaps 25, perhaps 30, hard to tell. A deep spear cut ran from her left jaw to her collarbone, days old, the edges angry and gray-rimmed with river water. One of her 2 short, pale tusks was broken at the root. Her dark green skin was bruised across her ribs in the pattern of multiple impacts, and the iron collar around her neck bore the mark of the Black Fang Syndicate. Slavers from the eastern routes, known in every valley from here to the coast. She had not fallen in a battle. She had escaped from chains. The snap point on the chain attached to the collar was the kind of break that came from mechanical force applied at the right angle, sustained over time. The kind of break a person made when they were willing to work at it long enough, regardless of the cost. Her amber eyes opened. They went from unconscious to alert in the fraction of a second, and her hand shot out and closed around his throat with a grip that had nothing gentle in it. Kaylin could feel his pulse immediately in the places her fingers pressed. The gray sky narrowed at its edges. He did not reach for the knife at his belt. He kept his hands open, invisible in the mud at his sides, and looked directly into her eyes. "I pulled you out," he said, or tried to say. It came out as a rough approximation of words through the compressed airway. "River, pulled you out." The grip did not release immediately. Her eyes moved across his face with the rapid assessment of someone reading a situation for threat. His hands in the mud, open, no weapon raised. His expression, which he was working to keep neutral. The river behind him, not the direction of a village. The grip eased by degrees. Cold air came back into his chest with an involuntary gasp he could not suppress. "Human," she said. Her voice was the sound of something large and deliberate, like stone moving against stone. "Kaylin," he corrected, coughing. "My name is Kaylin. And if you remain on this bank for another hour, the morning patrol from the settlement will find you. They are not going to pull you out of anything." She tried to push herself upright. The spear wound on her neck tore open again, dark red spreading through the collar of her armor, and her eyes rolled back and she went flat against the gravel. He sat in the mud beside her for a moment, listening to the river and his own breathing. Then he started calculating what he would need. Getting her from the riverbank to the lean-to behind his cottage took the better part of 2 hours and more of his bad knee than he had planned to spend. He used a canvas tarpaulin normally reserved for drying timber, wrapped her in it, dragged her by stages through the wet grass, stopping every time her weight shifted in a way that told him the tarpaulin was about to give. By the time he had her tucked behind the oak log stack under the overhang of his shed roof, covered with 3 wool blankets from his infantry days and with a small smokeless birch bark fire burning in the corner, his hands were shaking and his left leg had slipped past pain into the numb unreliability that came when the knee had been asked to do too much in cold and wet. He went inside, boiled water, gathered his yarrow and wild garlic, and went back out. The wound, when he could finally see it properly in the lean-to's lamplight, was worse than he had assessed in the fog at the riverbank. The spear had entered below the left ear and traveled downward at an angle, opening a channel 3 inches long through muscle and fat before stopping short of anything that would have ended the accounting immediately. 3 days in the Slate had done what river water always did to open wounds. The edges were softened and gray, the tissue around them beginning the particular process that led, if left unaddressed, to outcomes he had seen too many times to want to see again. He worked fast and without ceremony, the way he had learned to work in the trenches of Red Pass, where ceremony was a luxury that bled out before you finished performing it. The yarrow paste went in first, packed into the channel, followed by a tight linen wrap that would hold the edges in proximity long enough for them to begin deciding to close. He had cleaned wounds with worse tools in worse light. This was sufficient. She did not wake during any of it. Her body had clearly decided that sleeping through the medical attention was preferable to the alternative, which was a judgment he respected. He noted the iron collar each time he adjusted his angle. 3 inches of cold forged iron sitting against her throat, its black fang stamp catching the lamplight. Its chain end snapped and ragged where she had broken it. The break was not accidental. Someone had worked at that link deliberately and repeatedly over time. And the work had the quality of a person who had decided that the chain was going to go regardless of how long it took. She did not wake while he worked on the wound. He had learned rough field medicine in the trenches, the way all infantry learned it. Not from a physician, but from proximity to damage, and the knowledge that if he did not address a problem immediately, it would address itself in worse ways. The spear cut was deep, the edges packed with river silt and dark tissue that needed to come out before they could do anything else. He did what was necessary with practiced speed and without ceremony, pouring grain alcohol into the wound when he had cleaned it, tying off the linen tight. Her muscles contracted violently during the cleaning, and her hands fisted until the knuckles lost their color. But she did not open her eyes. By the time he finished, the fog had begun to thin. He washed his hands in a basin of cold water and sat at his kitchen table and listened to the singular quality of silence that comes after a decision has been made and before its consequences have arrived. The knock at the door was sharp and specific, the knock of official business, of a man who knows his authority and does not need to hammer. Kalen did not jump. He stood, moved to the door, and opened it 3 inches. Garrick was a broad man in his late 30s, weathered in the way of someone who spent his days outdoors in all weather, with a short sword on his hip and the kind of flat, careful eyes that infantry produced in men who paid attention long enough. He had 2 young guardsmen behind him on the gravel path. They had served together at Red Pass. Not in the same unit, but close enough to know each other's faces across a muddy field. Garrick had not asked to be militia captain of Oakhaven. It was what the valley offered a man with his skills after the war, and he had taken it because the alternative was less structured, and he preferred structure. He was not Thomas's man, exactly. He was the law's man, which was related but different. "Kalen," Garrick said, his eyes moving past Kalen's shoulder into the hallway in the practiced way of a man conducting an informal search. "Early morning." "River doesn't wait for the sun," Kalen said. His heart was moving at a different pace than his voice. He kept the voice level. "What brings the militia down to the mud?" Garrick explained. Merchant coming through the south gate. Blood on the road near the upper ford, the Black Fang Syndicate had lost a piece of property 3 nights back in the crags. Big one. Female. Had taken 3 fingers off the overseer before she jumped into the Slate. Kalen's eyes went briefly to Garrick's, then back to the middle distance. "That's 20 miles north." "Was 20 miles north," Garrick said. "Elder Thomas wants the bank searched from the ford down to the lake." His eyes dropped to Kalen's boots, which were crusted with fresh dark mud from the riverbank. "You been down at the water this morning?" "Every morning at 6, hauling driftwood before the current carries it past the mill." "Find anything interesting?" "Dead birch and 3 pine cones." He let the pause sit. "If there's an orc in the Slate, she's either at the bottom of the lake or floating face down past the blacksmith's by now. Water's running fast today." The young guardsmen shifted. One of them muttered something about iron chains and the current. Garrick looked at Kalen's face for a long time. He had known Kalen long enough to know when the man was lying. He had also known him long enough to know that Kalen did not lie without reason, and that his reasons, when he had them, tended to be the kind that a man who had been at Red Pass could follow even when he could not agree. "Thomas is offering 50 silver for her head," Garrick said quietly. "I don't farm bounty money," Kalen said. Another long silence. The wind off the river came through the doorway between them, smelling of cold water and wet pine. From the lean-to, muffled but distinct, came the dry snap of a pine branch breaking underfoot. Garrick's hand dropped to the pommel of his sword. The guardsmen raised their spears. "What was that?" Garrick said. Kalen held his eyes. "My goat. She's tied near the woodpile, likes to chew the bark." Garrick regarded him steadily. "You don't own a goat, Kalen?" "Bought her from Miller's boy 3 days ago. Unless the council's passed a law against old infantrymen keeping livestock while I wasn't paying attention." The silence stretched. Garrick's jaw worked once. He was doing the calculation Kalen was watching him do. What he knew, what he could prove, what it would cost the old soldier to have this go the way it was technically supposed to go. He was also doing the calculation Kalen had not expected, which was what it would cost himself. "We're going to search the bank," Garrick said, stepping back from the doorframe. "If we find anything on your land, Thomas won't care about your service record." Then you better get to searching, Kalin said, and closed the door. He stood in the hallway with his forehead against the oak planks. His breathing was not as steady as his voice had been. He stepped to the back door and out to the lean-to. The blankets were pushed aside. The fire was smoldering, but the space behind the log stack was empty. He pulled his hunting knife and stepped into the yard. "I know you're awake," he said quietly into the mist. "If you fight me now, those men with spears will be here before my blood hits the ground." A shadow came away from the woodpile. She was standing, barely, her weight heavy on a cedar fence post, one of his old wool coats pulled around her shoulders. In her right hand she held his iron splitting axe. She held it with the ease of someone for whom the weight was ordinary. "You lied to them," she said. Her speech was slow and deliberate, each word set down with care, as if the language was stone she was stacking. "Yes." "Why?" He studied her. This massive, green-skinned warrior in his wool coat with blood seeping through the fresh linen at her neck, holding his axe like she had been born holding axes. Her amber eyes doing to him what she had done to everything since she opened them. Reading him for threat, for motive, for the price that was coming. "Because I had a brother who died in a ditch," Kalin said. "And I promised myself 30 years ago I would not walk past a person drowning just because of what they looked like." She dropped her gaze to the axe in her hand, then back to him. She set the axe against the fence post. "I am Varka," she said, "of the Red River clan. Kalin, and we're in a considerable amount of trouble." She glanced toward the river, where Garrick's men were already audible in the downstream brush. Something moved through her expression. Not fear, precisely. Assessment. The calculation of someone who had already lost a great deal and was establishing what was left to lose. "Give me to them," she said. "Take the silver." Kalin thought of his cottage, the roof he had thatched with his own hands, the garden where the potatoes grew, the grave of his dog under the apple tree near the gate. He turned back and spat into the mud. "I'd rather burn the place down myself," he said. "Get back inside the shed. I need to pack flour in my winter boots. We leave through the South Marsh before the sun hits the mill." They did not make it quite that far before Thomas found out. Villages this size had no capacity for secrets, and Garrick's search, conducted technically and thoroughly, turned up the evidence of what had been in the lean-to, if not what had been in it. By midday, the militia had Kalin's land surrounded. By afternoon, Elder Thomas had his paper, which brought them here to the square in the rain, with the spear at his throat and Varka's chains clinking softly as she shifted her weight beside him. Thomas finished reading the confiscation order. He folded it precisely and returned it to his coat pocket. "The property reverts to the council as of this evening," he said. "You have until sundown to take what you can carry." Kalin scanned the gathered faces. He found Marin, the widow from 2 properties over, who had traded him eggs for firewood for 11 years, who had sat with him the day his dog died and asked no questions. She was the only person in the square who was not looking at him. She was looking at the wet cobblestones at her feet. This told him something. He found Garrick standing at the outer edge of the crowd, with his hand resting on the pommel of his sword and his face completely still. Garrick met Kalin's eyes once, directly, and then glanced away. Kalin noticed this too. "One night," Kalin said to Thomas. "I want one last night in my own house." Thomas considered this the way a man considers a small kindness that costs him nothing while demonstrating his authority. He allowed it. He rode back down the lane that evening with the satisfaction of a job well done. And Kalin stood in the mud of his own yard and watched him go and did not move for a long time afterward. That night, while Varka was hidden in the lean-to, Garrick came alone and on foot with a small leather purse. He set it on the fence post without coming through the gate. He met Kaylin's eyes across the fence and said nothing. Kaylin held the look. Garrick turned and walked back down the lane in the dark. Kaylin went to the fence post and picked up the purse. 20 silver pieces. Not from Thomas's bounty, which was 50, from somewhere else. He remained in the yard a while longer. He thought about the cottage while he packed. Not with sentiment. He was long past the age where sentiment was efficient. But with the specific accounting of what the place had cost him in years and what was leaving with it. The roof he had thatched section by section over the first winter, learning as he went because he could not afford to hire someone who already knew. The garden where the potatoes grew, which had taken 3 seasons to get right because the soil beside the slate was too wet for the first 2 feet down and needed drainage he had not initially understood. The dog, buried under the apple tree near the gate, who had been his only reliable companion for 9 of the 12 years, and who had died in the autumn 2 years ago of age, and the particular dignity of animals who know when they are finished. He had come to Oakhaven because it was as far as his military pension and a small land grant would take him. And because after Red Pass, he had understood that the kind of quiet he needed was not the quiet of people going about their days around him, but the quiet of no people. He had built his cottage and his routine and his reputation for odd but harmless solitude, and he had not regretted any of it. He had also, somewhere in the 12 years, stopped expecting it to be permanent. Things were never permanent. Permanence was a story people told themselves in good weather. He packed the flour and the salt and the medical kit and the chisel and the iron wedge and the matches and 2 pairs of wool socks and his knife and his walking stick and Garrick's 20 silver pieces, and he left everything else. In the morning they left through the South Marsh before the light was fully up. Kaylin with the canvas pack he had assembled in the dark hours, flour, salt, dried meat, his winter boots, the medical kit, the chisel and the iron wedge, and Varka in his old infantry coat with the collar turned up. The chapel bell behind them was ringing the wrong pattern for the hour. The double strike that meant something had happened that the village needed to know about. They moved fast through the marsh, as fast as 2 people with a bad knee and a spear wound could move. The bog was half frozen, the deer path slick and treacherous. The sedge grass cutting at their hands when they grabbed for balance. Kaylin led with his oak walking stick, testing the ground ahead. Behind him, Varka moved in a silence that was disciplined rather than easy. Her breathing controlled, her amber eyes scanning the tree line at regular intervals the way a soldier scanned it. By mid-morning, they heard the hounds. Kaylin stopped and listened. The double stroke of the chapel bell, the particular pitch of the hounds in the eastern marsh, valley bloodhounds, bred for tracking across mixed terrain, noses that worked through mud and rain and the masking smell of bog water. "They have scent," Varka said from behind him. Her voice had gained something in the hours since dawn. Steadier, the deliberate quality of it now sounding less like labor and more like precision. "The wind is directly behind us," Kaylin said. He was already looking at the terrain, the narrow deer path ahead squeezing between 2 dry peat banks thick with dead gorse. 12 years of cutting timber in all weather had given him a workable knowledge of what burned and what didn't. "How far back?" "Quarter mile, moving fast." He dropped the canvas pack and unstrapped the glass jar of boot oil he had packed. Lard, turpentine, pine resin, the waterproofing compound he had mixed himself every autumn. He walked back down the path to the gap between the peat banks and smashed the jar against the dry roots at the base, letting the thick compound coat the dead vegetation and pool in their own footprints. He struck a match. The fire caught with a sound like an exhaled breath turning into something larger. The dry gorse went instantly, the peat beneath it igniting with the particular thick smoke of organic material burning badly and producing maximum disagreement with any set of lungs trying to breathe near it. The wind carried the black wall directly back down the path. The baying of the hounds dissolved into confused yelping. 20 minutes, Kalen said, retrieving his pack. Move. For the first time, something briefly altered in Varka's expression. Not a smile exactly, the shadow of one. You are a treacherous old man, she said. Infantry, Kalen corrected, pushing her toward the ridge. We're trained to be annoying. The mountain pass above the marsh was a different kind of difficulty. Not the hidden danger of the bog, but the open declared brutality of high terrain in autumn. The slate was sharp and treacherous where the frost had cracked it. The shale loose enough that each step required a moment's assessment. The temperature dropped 15 degrees before they reached the first significant elevation and kept dropping. Kalen's bad knee had moved into its late-phase failure mode, the one where the joint stopped sending useful pain signals and simply began to refuse cooperation in a general and comprehensive way. He kept his weight on the oak stick and kept moving. Beside him, Varka's breathing had developed the shallow, careful rhythm of someone managing a chest wound through exertion, not worrying yet, but monitoring. She moved differently on the mountain than she had in the marsh. In the bog, she had followed his lead because he knew the terrain. Here, without discussion, she began to navigate, not pushing him aside, but moving slightly ahead at the decision points, taking the routes that his injured leg would manage better, choosing the angle of ascent that avoided the worst of the loose shale. He noticed this. He said nothing. He followed where she led. The turpentine fire bought them more time than he had projected. The bog peat, once ignited under the accelerant, burned with a thick, disagreeable smoke that the valley bloodhounds found genuinely intolerable. He could hear the confusion in their voices change register 3 separate times as they attempted and abandoned different approaches to the fire gap, each attempt ending in the same yelping retreat. Elder Thomas's men were valley militia, good at what they were built for, which was patrolling known routes between known points. They were not infantry. They did not improvise well under unexpected conditions. He had been counting on this. By the time they cleared the peat bog and hit the first real incline of the Black Ridge Crags, the sounds from behind them had been swallowed by distance and the particular acoustics of mountain terrain, which bent sound in ways that made tracking difficult for anyone not trained specifically for it. Varka had stopped scanning the tree line behind them and begun scanning the terrain ahead, which told him she had also arrived at the conclusion that the immediate pursuit was ended. He did not say anything about this. He kept moving. By the time the last light was leaving the sky, they had found the abandoned slate quarry, a deep horseshoe-shaped cutting in the cliff face left by miners 2 decades gone, a half-rotted timber shed under a tin roof that had turned the color of old blood. Inside, the shelter of walls, protection from the wind that had been building all afternoon into something serious. Kalen collapsed against the stone. His stick clattered on the floor. Varka dropped to a flat boulder across the space and sat heavily, her breath coming in audible pulls. The green of her skin had gone gray at the edges in the way he had been watching for. The gray that came when a body was putting everything it had into keeping the blood moving and the organs running and had nothing left for the surface. He pulled his water skin and offered it. She took it and drank without ceremony and passed it back. 10 minutes, she said. 1 hour, he said. Your wound. She did not argue this time. She let him cut away the soaked bandaging. The yarrow paste had held the infection, but the cold and exertion had reopened the cut itself, and the edges needed to be drawn together with something more permanent than the initial field dressing. He had needle and waxed hemp thread in the kit. I don't have grain alcohol left, he said. I have had iron driven through my skin 4 times, Varka said. Once in battle at Red Pass, twice in the slaver pens, once by my brother's hand while I slept. Kalen's needle stopped. Your brother, he said. Varka's amber eyes went flat in the way of stone going underwater. Gramash. He held the chieftain's seat after my father died. He needed iron weapons from the eastern warlords to hold it. The other clans were pressing, and iron was the only language they understood. The warlords did not want cattle or grain. They wanted tribute in bodies. She paused, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has told a true thing so many times it has stopped needing inflection. He put the collar on me while I slept. He told the clan I drowned in the spring flood. Kaelin fixed on the iron collar around her neck. And you broke the chain, he said, on the slaver's wagon during a mountain storm. The chains were corroded from 3 months of rain and mountain cold. I worked at one link for 6 hours. She glanced at the broken chain end, still attached to the collar. When it gave, I jumped into the slate. In iron chains. The current took me faster than they could follow on horseback. She met his eyes. I did not expect to surface. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he threaded the needle and set it. The sutures were not his best work. The hemp was coarser than proper surgical thread, and the lamplight was poor, but they were correct, pulling the edges of the cut together cleanly. And when he tied the final knot, the wound held. She had not made a sound throughout. He returned to his side of the quarry and packed the kit away. My brother died at Red Pass, he said, to the stone wall rather than to her. He was 18. He went into a forward trench and took a belly wound, and I was 100 yards away and could not reach him in time. The trench was full of water. He was quiet for a moment. It was after that I decided I would not walk past another person in a ditch. Varka said nothing for a while. The wind outside the quarry had found the gaps in the tin roof and was speaking through them in a low, sustained note. That was your reason, she said finally. Part of it. What is the other part? He regarded his hands. The knuckles were cracked from the cold, the old scar from a felling accident on his right palm, white against the weathered skin. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I'm still accounting. She studied him a long time with the amber eyes that assessed everything they touched. Then she turned toward the quarry entrance and scooped a fistful of sleet from where it had piled against the timber frame and brought it back and held it out to him without being asked. His water skin was empty. He had not said so. He took the sleet and let it melt against his palm and did not say thank you. She sat back down. Neither of them said anything further about it. In the mine shaft that night, when the quarry proved too open to the wind and they found the abandoned ironworks a quarter-mile up the cliff face, he set the chisel against the collar's rivet and raised the iron wedge and stopped. He met her eyes. She had her head tilted back against the stone wall, the thick green column of her throat exposed, the rusted iron band visible against her skin. She regarded him with the flat completeness of someone who has decided they would rather risk a wrong strike than continue wearing a wrong thing. Hit it, she said. He hit it. The rivet split on the third strike, the iron collar falling apart at the join and landing in the mine dust with a sound that echoed further into the shaft than Kaelin expected. The silence after it was precise and different from the silence before. She reached up with both hands and touched her own throat. Not the wound, below the wound, the raw skin where the iron had rested for 3 months, the mark of it still dark against the green. She held her hands there and did not perform anything. Her expression was doing something complicated that had no single word for it, the particular landscape of a person discovering what their own skin felt like after it has been returned to them. Kaelin picked up the collar. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight and the cold of it. Then he threw it as far into the shaft as his arm could manage. They listened to it ring and clatter down into the darkness until the sound stopped. Neither of them spoke. He moved back to his side of the mine. She moved her hands down from her throat and looked at nothing in particular for a while. He had not planned to notice the specific green of her skin in the firelight. He noticed it anyway, the way the flames caught the undertone in it, something between pine and deep water, different from the gray daylight color of the marsh. He glanced away when he realized he was looking. She was looking at her own hands, turning them over slowly, the way a person held something they had been given back unexpectedly. Her hands were large, precise, scarred in the places where years of weapon work left marks. She turned them over for a long time. "In the clan," she said, without looking up, "a warrior who loses their weapons in battle is expected to feel shame. I had no weapons when I came out of that river." He regarded his own hands, the calloused places, the old felling scar on his right palm. "You had the chain link you worked for 6 hours," he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the direction a face moved before it decided not to smile yet. She looked back at her hands. "That is a generous accounting," she said. "Infantry," he said. "We count what works." In the morning, her color had come back. They crossed the Black Ridge crags on the second day, when the sleet had cleared and the sky above the peaks was the hard blue of high-altitude winter. She navigated the last of the passes in a way that made his military compass unnecessary. Reading the mountains by peak angle and wind direction and the deliberate manner the snowfield lay on the southern faces. Methods that did not belong to any tradition of navigation he had encountered and which were entirely accurate. "How do you know which way?" he asked, on a ledge where the wind was making conversation expensive. "I was born in these crags," she said. "My clan's summer grazing was in the high valley on the eastern face. I know this mountain from the underside." He filed this. He had been filing things about her since the riverbank. Distinct competencies, precise knowledge, the specific way she moved through terrain that told him she was not a blunt instrument, but a precise one, applied with care to situations that required precision. She knew which plants in the high country were edible and which were not. She knew which exposed ground at altitude would hold a campfire and which would not, and why. She knew how to read coming weather in the quality of light on snow, which saved them twice from being caught on exposed rock faces. She did not explain these things unless asked. She simply did them, and he watched. And gradually he quit asking how, and simply trusted the direction. On the afternoon of the third day, they stood on a bluff above the southern slope and looked down at the free borderlands. Below them, in a wide river valley where two channels met, the thin smoke of a settlement rose from timber cabins and stone buildings. Crossing had been built by the people that other places did not want. Soldiers who had decided the war was finished, regardless of what the kingdom said. Former laborers who had outlasted their indentures. A collection of different peoples who had collectively decided that the alternative to getting along was too expensive and too familiar. "Humans and orcs," Varka said, watching a figure at the base of a forge that was clearly not human, working alongside a figure at the bellows that clearly was. "And others," Kaelin said. "It's not easy country, but nobody asks what name you carried before the river." She surveyed the settlement for a long time, at the children along the fence line, at the wagons moving without scrutiny toward the mill, at the old orc woman at a market stall who happened to look up at that moment, perhaps catching the movement of two figures on the bluff above, and held the look for a moment before returning to her work. "It looks whole," Varka said. The word was quiet, as if saying it at full volume might require something she was not ready to give. "It's a choice more than a condition," Kaelin said. They hiked down the switchback trail in the late afternoon and entered Crossing as the light turned the surrounding pine stands copper. People looked up from their work and went back to it. A dwarf mending a wagon wheel nodded. The old orc woman at the herb stall looked at the faded iron mark on Varka's neck, visible above the coat collar, and gave a single brief nod that contained a full history Kaelin could not read, and Varka clearly could. The old orc woman at the herb stall in Crossing looked at Varka for a long moment, and then looked at Kaelin, and then looked at the faded mark on Varka's neck, visible above the coat collar in the afternoon light. The discoloration of 3 months of iron against skin. And she said one word, in a language Kaelin did not speak. Varka's expression, which was usually controlled in the manner of a person who had learned the cost of not controlling it, shifted briefly into something he could not read. "What did she say?" he asked when they were past the stall. "She said, 'Free.'" Varka did not look at him when she said this. She was looking at the settlement around them, the different people going about the ordinary business of a day, the children who belonged to no single category of face or skin color, the forge where an orc and a human worked the same metal without it requiring explanation. In the old tongue, it means free, but it also means the thing after iron. There is no exact translation. He looked at her. The afternoon light was catching the faded line of the collar mark, nearly invisible now after the weeks of travel and the clean air of the high passes. "Good word," he said. She said nothing. They kept walking. At the land registry hall, Kaelin opened Garrick's purse and poured the silver pieces out. 20 of them, heavy and bright. 3 acres along the lower river bend, he said. Timber, a garden plot, room for a barn. Varka set the iron axe and the broken slaver's rivet on the bench beside his silver. The rivet she had kept from the mine. He had not asked why. "You have the coin for the land," she said. "I have the arms for the timber and the knowledge for the building." He looked at the silver in his hand, then at the rivet on the bench, then at her. "Together," he said. The cabin took 3 months. They built it in the way that 2 people built things when they both knew how to build, but from different traditions. Not arguing over method exactly, but negotiating it, each discovering that the other's approach had solved problems that theirs had not considered. Her clan construction techniques for interlocking the corner joints made the structure stronger than any single tradition build. His knowledge of river valley waterproofing and mortar made the foundation viable through the spring thaw. What resulted was something that belonged to neither of them entirely, and to both of them together. He noticed that the mark left by the iron collar had faded almost entirely about 6 weeks into the build. He noticed this the way he noticed most things that mattered, not immediately, but in the specific moment when a change became undeniable. She had her coat off because the work was warm and the afternoon was clear, and the light was coming from the west. And in that light, the skin of her neck above the old wound scar was the same deep forest green as everything else. The iron mark was gone. He did not say anything about it. He went back to the timber joint he was fitting. Later, he understood that he had not said anything about it, because saying it would have required him to explain how he knew what the mark had looked like before, which would have required him to explain how often he had looked at her neck, which was information he was not prepared to deliver at that juncture. She worked beside him for the rest of the afternoon and said nothing. And he said nothing. And the cabin went up another 3 feet. And the river below them caught the last of the light and held it until the dark came. The cabin building had its own education. He had built his Oakhaven cottage from plans he had found in a timber guild manual, which produced a structure that was correct by the standards of valley construction and less than optimal for mountain weather. Varka's clan had been building in high-altitude terrain for generations, and the precise problems of that environment, the differential settling of frozen and thawed ground, the load distribution required to handle snow accumulation across a roof, the airflow patterns that determined where a fireplace would draw correctly and where it would not, had produced techniques he had not encountered. She did not explain them at length. She demonstrated them and let him observe and ask questions when the observation alone was insufficient. He asked questions. She answered them with the precision of someone who had learned these things through practice rather than instruction, which meant the answers were exact and correct rather than theoretical and approximate. He noted the difference. He had always preferred the kind of knowledge that came from doing the thing. There was a morning in the third week of the cabin build when he came around the east corner of the frame with a timber on his shoulder and found her standing still, looking at something in the middle distance. He stopped. She was not assessing terrain or reading weather or doing any of the things she did when she went still. She was simply standing in the early light, her face slightly turned toward the river below, her silver-streaked black braid catching the frost in the air. He had the brief, specific experience of being in the presence of something that did not require anything from him, that was simply there and complete in itself. He set the timber down quietly and went to get another plank. When he came back, she was working again. She did not mention that she had seen him stop. He did not mention that he had stopped. There was an afternoon in the second month when he was setting the corner joint on the north wall, using his usual method, and she came and waited beside him and studied what he was doing and said, "The grain is wrong." He looked at the timber. The grain looked fine to him. She showed him what she was reading in it, the specific growth pattern that indicated how the wood would move when it dried, and how his joint would accommodate that movement versus how it would not. He observed what she showed him. He pulled the joint apart and reset it her way. The north wall joint has not moved since, which is the correct outcome and also its own answer to a question neither of them had asked directly. There was an evening in the second month when the wind came down hard from the crags and they were inside in front of the fireplace that was not yet finished but was functional, both doing their separate work, he with a piece of shaping wood, she with a drawing she was making of the joint system for the roof beams. And he moved to sit closer to the fire. Not closer to her, closer to the fire. But the fire was on her side of the room, and the result was the same. And neither of them said anything about it. And the silence between them had a different quality than the silence in the mine shaft or on the mountain, a quality that had been building so gradually he could not have named the moment it changed. She asked him one evening near the end of construction what he planned to do when the cabin was finished. He considered this. "I haven't thought past finishing it," he said. She looked at him with the amber eyes that were always doing more than they appeared to do. "That is the first time you have not had a plan." "Yes," he said. "Does that concern you?" He looked at the half-finished structure around them, at the precise joinery of the corner interlocks she had shown him, at the river visible through the gap where the window frame would go. "It's the first time not having one has felt correct," he said. "I'm still accounting for what that means." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she went back to her drawing. The first snows came down off the crags in the beginning of the fourth month. They sat on the low porch of the finished cabin in the late afternoon as the flakes began, not heavily, the first exploratory snow of a season feeling out the valley below it. The river was visible through the pine stand, gray and moving. Varka said, "My clan does not forgive. Gramash still holds the chieftain's seat, most likely. He will come eventually, when the right trader carries the right information to the wrong ear." "I know," Kalen said. "That is not a small thing to carry." "Neither was pulling someone out of a river," he said. "I did that anyway." She glanced away from the river and looked at him. He looked back. Something in her assessment, that comprehensive, systematic reading of everything she encountered, arrived at its particular conclusion. And for the first time, He saw the arrival of it clearly in her face. It did not express itself as warmth, exactly. Something more durable than warmth. "You are a difficult man, Kaelin," she said. "My knee agrees with you," he said. She almost smiled. The almost was precise and real and gone before it could be named. The snow fell on the river below them, on the pine stand, on the 3 acres of land they had registered together, and the cabin they had built from 2 sets of knowledge and 1 point of agreement. Inside the hearth was burning. The first real fire in a finished house, throwing its light through the window gap into the blue early dark of the first winter. He had walked out of Oakhaven with a canvas pack and a bad knee and no land and no plan. She had jumped into the Slate River with iron chains and no destination and nothing left to lose. Between those 2 starting points, through marsh and mountain and the specific weight of what it cost to make a choice without permission from anyone, they had arrived at a place that was theirs. The snow fell. The river moved. The cabin held against the mountain wind in the way of something built by people who understood which joints mattered and where to stand.